This episode of the Great War 1919 is sponsored by Battlefront Miniatures, the creators of Flames of War, and their new miniatures wargame The Great War. Supported by a complete range of miniatures and terrain, including trenches, tanks, and guns, The Great War provides a full selection of models suitable for wargaming, collecting, or modeling. Even better, detailed research into the units and tactics of 1918 lets you bring to life the armies that fought on the Western Front. If you want to get started, we recommend one of their army deals, like Steiner Stosstruppen. Modeled after the German stormtroopers, these troops are great in trench raids and the ensuing hand-to-hand combat. If you prefer Entente troops, British, French, and American army deals are also available. For viewers of the Great War channel, we even have two special offers. First, you go to greatwar.flamesofwar.com and you can use the code GreatWarChannel1 to get 25% off the 234-page, hardcover, full-color Great War rulebook, which features all available troops, their abilities, and also historical background information. Second, you can also use the code GreatWarChannel2 to get 10% off any Great War Army deals and unit cards, plus free shipping worldwide. Now, of course, you can use both codes for the same order, and you can find all the links and additional information in the video description below. So thanks again to the Great War Miniatures game for sponsoring our episode. And now, on to the show. It's spring 1919, and though peace is being discussed in Paris, the vast expanses of revolutionary Russia are burning. Counter-revolutionary forces are about to launch an attack on the Bolshevik heartland, small nations are arming themselves for independence, and the Allies attempt to intervene. Это гражданская война в России. It's the Russian Civil War. Hi, I'm Jesse Alexander and welcome to the Great War. The civil war raging in the lands of the old Russian Empire in the early months of 1919 was without doubt the biggest conflict in the aftermath of the First World War. Actually, it was more like several wars going on at once because the fighting involved numerous different factions. There were revolutionary Bolsheviks, counter-revolutionary forces, independence movements, and foreign forces, plus peasant uprisings. And not all of them were Russian. I think British Prime Minister David Lloyd George might have said it best when he wrote, "Russia was a jungle in which no one could say what was within a few yards of him." So let's start to make sense of the conflict by asking ourselves this basic question. How did Russia get to be such a mess in the first place? So after the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks were able to spread out quite quickly from their base in the main industrial cities of European Russia. The chaos and disorder meant there was little resistance to this so-called triumphal march of Soviet power. The imperial army was disintegrating at this time, and the aristocracy had basically just fled. So Bolshevik leader Vladimir Lenin even announced to the Moscow Soviet in April 1918, "It can be said with certainty that, in the main, the civil war has ended." Well, Lenin could not have been more wrong. The forces of the Central Powers advanced that spring towards the east, occupying the western part of the empire. The famous Czech Legion, which was made up of some 55,000 former Austro-Hungarian prisoners of war, mutinied and turned on the Bolsheviks, which cut off most of Eastern Russia from Bolshevik power. Now, the Allies also decided to intervene and sent some 30,000 British, French, American, Japanese, Serbian, Italian, and Polish troops into the country, mostly in the far north around the town of Arkhangelsk and in the far east at the strategic port of Vladivostok. The forces of the counter-revolution, led by former Tsarist generals, had begun to organize with Allied help, and fierce fighting took place in 1918, especially in the south and east, and particularly along the railway lines in what became known as the Echelonnaya Vojna, or train war. Now, as 1918 ended and 1919 began, the Civil War entered a new and more intense phase with the Allied defeat of the Central Powers. German and Austrian troops began to pull out of the territories that they had occupied for most of the year. That is to say, the Baltics, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and the Caucasus, many of whose people wanted independence. In other parts of the country, the counter-revolutionary forces were now ready to take the offensive against the Red Army. So that was a little refresher for 1918. Now let's take a closer look at the different factions at the start of 1919 so we can see just who is fighting whom and why. So let's start with some familiar faces, the Allies. In early 1919, the British, the French, the Japanese, the Americans, the Poles, the Serbs, and the Italians had a dilemma on their hands. In theory, now that the Germans were out of Russia, they had a free hand, but in practice they weren't quite sure what to do with it. They'd intervened in 1918 to deny the Germans material and strategic advantages, to support the counter-revolutionaries, and to protect their own economic interests. But now their people wanted peace, and their soldiers didn't really see the point of remaining in a foreign and dangerous country once the Great War had been won. But they also desperately wanted to stop the revolution from spreading and argued amongst themselves at the Paris Peace Conference about how this could best be achieved. French General Ferdinand Foch and British Minister Winston Churchill supported full-scale military intervention. As Churchill put it, "After having defeated all the tigers and lions, I don't like to be defeated by baboons." But Lloyd George, Clemenceau, and Wilson were not so keen on putting more blood and treasure into the Russian mess. They had bigger fish to fry at the peace conference with the establishment of the League of Nations, demobilizing their armies, and creating new borders in Central Europe. In the words of Lloyd George, "I would rather leave Russia Bolshevik until she sees her way out of it than see Britain bankrupt. And that is the surest road to Bolshevism in Britain." The French, who were worried about recovering the money they'd lent to Russia before the revolution, did eventually send an intervention force to southern Ukraine in late 1918. But other than Foch, they preferred a more indirect strategy of supporting the smaller countries in Central Europe as a so-called cordon sanitaire, a preventive bulwark that would stop the Russian Revolution from spreading to the West. Wilson was also quite wary, and he wrote that to be dragged further into the Russian chaos would be fatal. Now, the Allies made some attempts at diplomacy in early 1919, but these failed because none of the warring parties wanted to negotiate, and the Allies themselves refused to recognize the Bolshevik government. Their approach then shifted to an indirect war against Bolshevism. They would support those who were fighting the Bolsheviks, but they were also going to begin a slow withdrawal of their troops starting in spring 1919. All right, so much for the Allies. They weren't particularly sure how to engage, but they were sure that they didn't like the prospect of a Bolshevik Russia. Let's turn our attention to the Russian factions now, and thankfully, they are color-coded, which makes it a little bit easier to sort out. We'll get started with the Red faction, the Bolsheviks. Now, their objective was to consolidate the revolution and re-establish control over the vastness of the empire that had fallen to pieces. They also wanted to spread the revolution abroad, especially to Germany. To further this goal, they founded the Third Communist International in March of 1919, which most communist parties of Europe attended. Now, this ideological fervor made them many enemies, but it also allowed them to produce coherent and targeted propaganda for the population. Now, the centers of Bolshevik power were the big industrial cities in European Russia with large populations of factory workers like Moscow and Petrograd. They did have some support among minority groups and in cities in other parts of the country, but in early 1919 they depended on the traditional Russian heartland, and on March 5th they even moved the capital from Petrograd to Moscow, which was farther away from enemy troops. Now, in the central zone they controlled, the Bolsheviks attempted to impose what they called war communism. Now, this was a policy which saw them forcibly take food from peasants to feed the hungry Red Army and city workers. They also tried to organize, centralize, and nationalize the economy, the ownership of land, and industry as well. Now, the peasants, who made up the majority of the population, did not take kindly to these policies and resisted them. The Bolsheviks responded by launching what became known as the Red Terror, to impose control by force of arms. The secret police, known as the Cheka and led by Felix Dzerzhinsky, tortured and killed thousands of peasants, especially the wealthier kulaki, plus middle-class bourgeois, and they regularly took hostages to ensure the delivery of food and labor. Lenin wanted this done so the people will see, tremble, know, shout. The Bolsheviks are strangling and will strangle the bloodsucker kulaks. Now, they also set up thousands of prisoner and labor camps, in addition to running over 21,000 prisons. Unsurprisingly, these atrocities turned much of the population against the Bolsheviks. So, although the Reds dominated the Russian heartland, most of the important industrial areas, and a population of 60 million people, conditions were still chaotic, and their control over the vital food-producing countryside was fragile at best in the face of fierce peasant resistance. Now, the most significant counter-revolutionary forces were those of the Whites. They were a military nationalist movement started by former Tsarist Chief of Staff General Alexeyev before his death in 1918, and their members came mostly from the old officer class of the Imperial Army. They believed in Mother Russia and abhorred the Bolsheviks, and though they wished for a return to the old order, if not necessarily the Tsar, they lacked clarity of vision and coordination. The Whites faced all sorts of different challenges in their quest to turn back the red tide of revolution. For one thing, the areas they controlled in early 1919 were remote and totally underdeveloped, and they struggled to coordinate their actions. General Denikin was in command of the Volunteer Army and Allied Cossack forces in the North Caucasus and in South Russia. In the east, Admiral Kolchak squashed a fledgling all-Russian parliament that had been set up in part thanks to the protection of the Czech Legion, and assumed dictatorial powers from his new capital in the Siberian city of Omsk. In the Arctic, White forces were quite small and under direct British influence, and they would not play a decisive role in the fighting to come. Now, all three of the White zones were sparsely populated and had very few factories, which would make raising and equipping armies extremely difficult. But the Whites had help in the form of the Allied intervention forces. Allied troops were present in the same zones as the Whites, although only in the north did they see significant action against the Red Army directly. Now, once the leftover stocks of weapons and ammunition ran out towards the end of 1918, the White armies would be supplied by the Allies, especially the British. Throughout 1919, they would supply the Whites in the east with as many weapons and ammunition as the entire Soviet zone was able to produce, allowing the former Tsarist generals to continue the fight. In the south, the British also sent a military mission to train White troops and shipped 60 tanks and aircraft, which were manned by British crews who actually did see combat. Now, despite this advantage, White leaders could not coordinate their military and political goals with each other, or with the Allies, who were often not even aware of White plans. And as great Russian nationalists, they also had rocky relations with various minority groups, including the Cossacks fighting alongside them. And since they were military men, they lacked expertise and focus on establishing a functional civilian administration and economy. But they were missing a vital ingredient that the Bolsheviks and independence movements had: a clear and coherent vision they could bring to the people through propaganda. The White propaganda emphasized the Bolshevik evil and associated the revolution with the Jewish religion, drawing on previously existing anti-Semitism and justifying it as revenge for the Red Terror. As one White put it after the war, "They shouted death to the bourgeois, and we replied, death to the Yids." Now, the Whites engaged in a form of White terror of their own, killing and torturing those suspected of Red sympathies. Jews were especially targeted, and though Polish, Red Army, and in particular Ukrainian troops participated, many of the pogroms, which killed between 150 and 300,000 people, were carried out by White units. So, on the one side, we had the Red Bolsheviks that controlled the industrial centers and tried to establish their power through violence and terror. Their main opponents, the Whites, were spread through the vastness of Russia and couldn't agree on much more than that they wanted to get rid of the Bolsheviks through violence and terror. Now, there were some other colorful factions as well. The Greens were various peasant groups who rose up and revolted against the Bolsheviks, and the Blacks were an anarchist army based in eastern Ukraine. But we will get to them in a future episode because they definitely deserve a closer look of their own. Now, our final group of factions doesn't have a color. They are the smaller peoples on the western edge of the empire who were attempting to form new and independent states. Now, the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, along with Belarus, Ukraine, and Poland, had all declared independence in the chaos of 1918 and were fighting to maintain it. The fledgling nations rushed to recruit new armies and establish their borders in the face of hostility from the Bolsheviks, the Whites, and also sometimes from each other. Now, the Baltic states were too small and too weak to take on the Red Army on their own, and they relied on outside help, whether it be from the Finns, remaining German forces, Freikorps units, or the British Navy in the Baltic Sea. Now, others, like the Poles and the Ukrainians, would end up fighting the Reds mostly on their own. Now, it's important to note that some people from these areas, especially in the towns, fought on the Bolshevik side as well, the most famous being the Latvian Rifleman unit. Now, to further muddy the waters, the Reds also set up socialist governments in each region, which were competing with the independence movements. Alright, so by early 1919, the Russian Civil War is mostly a war between the Reds and the Whites in different regions of the former empire, while at the same time smaller nations are trying to establish themselves along the old border zone between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia. Now that we have an idea of who was doing the fighting, let's take a moment to look at how they actually fought each other. Now, the Russian Civil War was not an easy war to fight. All sides had to deal with huge distances, poor transportation and communication networks, and a completely wrecked economy. Russia had been absolutely devastated by revolution, occupation by the Central Powers, and civil war through 1917 and also in 1918. Industrial production was a fraction of what it had been during the war, and food was extremely scarce. Food was so scarce that zoo animals were eaten in Petrograd, and in Armenia, the pre-war goat population of about 1 million fell to just 6,000. Think about that, and remember the goats. Now, actual combat was also a little different than in the Great War. Because of the distances involved, railways were critical for the entire course of the Civil War, and armored trains were used to project power between the isolated cities. And just to clarify a popular misconception here, fighting armored trains under these circumstances was not a trivial thing. You couldn't just blow up the tracks and ambush the train like in a movie. Because the railroad was not just your enemy's supply route, it was also your own side's supply route once you'd taken out their armored train. Tactics also evolved throughout the conflict, and eventually the trains were accompanied by supporting infantry and mounted escorts as well. Now, unlike on the Western Front, cavalry was quite important in the wide open spaces, and a horse-drawn machine gun cart, known as the tachanka, became a common source of mobile firepower. There were only a few tanks and airplanes, which the British and French provided to the Whites. In early 1919, the White troops were actually better trained and equipped than the Reds, but fewer in number, and they were very officer-heavy. By February 1919, the Red Army, under the direction of War Commissar Leon Trotsky, had grown to 500,000 men, but many of these were recently conscripted and poorly trained peasants. Now, the Reds were also struggling to impose a command structure and discipline, and to integrate former Tsarist officers and political instructors, who were known as commissars, into their ranks. Both armies constantly suffered from desertions and fluctuations in their morale as well. All right, now that we have an idea of the kind of warfare being waged on the battlefields of the Russian Civil War, let's take a look at how the fighting played out in early 1919. Well, now let's start in the north, where there were bitter but small-scale skirmishes that we reported on in the last episode. The terrain, the weather, and the few railway lines made military operations extremely difficult. The Allied forces in this area fought directly against the Red Army and actually commanded White troops, which was not the case elsewhere, even though Bolshevik propaganda claimed otherwise. The main battles between the Whites and the Reds would take place in the south and in the east, so let's turn our attention there. In southern Russia, Cossack forces of the Don host and the Kuban People's Republic, allied to the Whites, overstretched themselves, attempting to take the city of Tsaritsyn, which is today's Volgograd, and were routed by Red troops. Their lands would now become subject to a particular form of Red terror known as Razkazachivanie, or de-Cossacization, which was meant to stamp out Cossack cultural identity and will to fight. This defeat led to a united Cossack and White command, which would be called the Armed Forces of Southern Russia. Now, even further south, in the Caucasus, the Whites launched a major offensive against a Red army that was suffering badly from typhus. The Reds could barely supply their troops via camel caravan from Astrakhan, which was about 500 kilometers away. And though outnumbered 3-1 and lacking in supplies themselves, the Whites smashed the Reds, captured the cities of Grozny, Vladikavkaz, and Pyatigorsk. As it would turn out, this was the single biggest White victory of the war. 2 entire Red armies of 150,000 men were destroyed, and about 50,000 prisoners were taken. Now, after this crushing defeat, Trotsky summed up the state of the Red Army in the south. A swollen army, really a horde rather than an army, has clashed with Denikin's properly organized troops, and in a few weeks has been reduced to dust. Now, these numbers give us an idea of the scale of the fighting, which compares to some of the battles of the Great War. And now we're going to take a look east, where the White armies were also fighting, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. In the east, the White Admiral Kolchak's army was in a good position to launch an attack westwards, because in December 1918 his troops had defeated the Red Army and took the key city of Perm. The Bolsheviks sent a certain Joseph Stalin to investigate this disaster, and he reported that the retreat had been an absolutely disorderly flight of an utterly routed and completely demoralized army. And only about 1/3 of the Red troops made it to the new front line, and many of them deserted. Kolchak therefore sought to make use of his advantage and attacked again in March towards the city of Ufa and the Volga River. Now, this would allow him to threaten the Bolshevik center of power and give him better access to new recruits, railway lines, and food sources. On this front, the Whites actually outnumbered the Reds, but the White troops were inexperienced and young, and the Red Army had large reserves in its rear and an advantage in artillery. Now, at first, the White offensive sliced through the Red Army and sent it reeling on a retreat of hundreds of kilometers to the west. But ultimately, the offensive came to an end short of its objectives, and the Volga remained out of reach for the Whites. So, to sum up, we have skirmishing in the north, both Red and White victories in the south, and a White advance in the east. Now let's have a look at the situation in what had been Western Russia. Here, the retreat of German and Austrian troops after the November 11th armistice seemed to present a golden opportunity for the Bolsheviks. They now felt they could strike down the local independence movements and carry the revolution into Europe as they had dreamed. So even though the Red Army was quite weak, they went over to the attack in January. The Bolsheviks were met by troops loyal to the new republics and also by foreign forces supporting them. In the Baltic, the Red Army first advanced, but then was stopped and partially thrown back by local forces with the assistance of Finnish and German Freikorps troops, including the famous Eiserne Division, also known as the Iron Division, plus British naval support in the Baltic Sea. In February, fighting was particularly heavy as the Reds were halted outside the new Lithuanian capital of Kaunas. Now, Polish and Bolshevik forces also clashed at a place called Bereza Kartuska. Each side was advancing into the gap left by retreating German forces who had kept them apart up until this point. Now, these skirmishes marked the beginning of a full-scale Polish-Soviet war, but we will cover that more in depth in the future. In Ukraine, Simon Petliura's Ukrainian People's Republic and the allied West Ukrainian People's Republic had little outside help. French troops based in Odessa and White forces in the region did not have good relations with the Ukrainians, and neither did the neighboring Poles, who also laid claim to the city of Lviv, which is known as Lwów in Polish. The Ukrainians were driven back and lost their capital of Kiev to the Reds in February. Caught between the advancing Red Army and rival Poles, in early 1919 the future of independent Ukraine looked grim indeed. So to sum it all up, by the late winter of 1919, the Allied-supported Whites seemed well established in the south and east, while the Reds were stalled in the west, and the revolution's outcome was still in doubt. Lenin himself proclaimed, "Our situation has never been so dangerous as it is now. The imperialists were busy amongst themselves, but now one of the groups has been wiped out by the group of the English, French, and the Americans. They consider their main task to be to smother world Bolshevism, to smother its main center, the Russian Soviet Republic." So now that we've taken a deep dive into the Russian civil wars, it's time for a roundup segment where we take a look at what else is going on in February 1919. Let's start in Paris at the Peace Conference, where on the 7th, the Italian delegates published a memorandum claiming full recognition of the terms of the Treaty of London of 1915, which awarded them former Austrian territory, plus the city of Fiume. The treaty presented a problem for the Allies, who wanted to give some of the land promised to Italy to the new Yugoslav kingdom. And this would soon turn into one of the most difficult questions of the conference, especially as the Yugoslavs themselves proposed an extension of their borders on the 18th of February. On the 13th, Japan proposed a racial equality clause during the League of Nations discussions, but this was rejected after opposition from the United States and Australia. A French proposal for a League of Nations army was also defeated. The very next day, Wilson presented the draft text of the Covenant of the League of Nations, which had been prepared in just 2 weeks. He then left for home to shore up domestic support in Congress. On the 19th, a French anarchist attempted to assassinate French Prime Minister Georges Clemenceau, who survived despite being shot. Now, turning to other news, on February 6th, the new German parliament met in the city of Weimar, since Berlin was considered too unstable. The majority Social Democrats had won the recent election, while the independent Social Democrats had suffered a resounding defeat. On the 8th, French General Franchet d'Espéry joined the Allied occupation forces in Constantinople, and 2 days later, the city was divided into British, French, and Italian zones of occupation. On the 16th, the new Republic of German Austria went to the polls, which resulted in the election of a social democratic government, but which would struggle with border conflicts to the east with Hungary and to the south with Yugoslavia and Italy. And finally, on February 19th, an American delegation led by William Bullitt went to Moscow to meet the Bolsheviks to discuss pre-war debt payment and diplomatic relations. Now, nothing would come of the mission as the Bolsheviks refused to repay the debts and Wilson refused to recognize the Bolshevik regime. So those were some of the main developments in Paris and across Europe in February 1919, and we can already see that just a few weeks into the peace conference, the road to a settlement on which all could agree was murky indeed. Alright, so two of my main sources for this episode were Evan Mawdsley's The Russian Civil War and Orlando Figue's A People's Tragedy. And you can find all our sources for this episode in the video description, including links to Amazon. And if you buy through these links, we do get a small commission, which helps support the channel. And of course, you can also support us on Patreon, which gets you access to our Patreon podcast and other perks. We've also got some new merchandise available, like this poster behind me, so give our store a look. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this is The Great War 1919, a production of real-time history and the only YouTube history channel that can see more than a few yards in the Russian jungle.